So that's just a reminder that the people in Zoom will be able to hear the room and your voices will be recorded, but not your picture. Hello and welcome to the debate seminar series, What is a Just Green Transition? Democratic Challenges in Greening Capitalism. And welcome to the first debate. I'm Lindsay Whitfield, Professor of Business and Development here at Copenhagen Business School, as everyone here in the audience knows. But I'm also introducing myself to the people online. I'm also, few of you may know, director of something called the Observatory for Just Green Transitions. And this is the first official event of the Observatory, so I'm just going to say a few words about it. The Observatory is a collaborative platform for research and education, and it's co-organized by the Center for Business and Development Studies here at Copenhagen Business School and the Democracy Institute at the Central European University, where I work closely in leading the Observatory with my colleague, David Karas. And the Observatory is generously funded by Open Society Foundation. So I wanted to say a little bit about the debate seminar series before we start, since this is the first one. I think it has two unique features that I want to point out. First, it tries to live up to its name, which is fostering debate. So we have not organized a series of presentations where people will talk at you, but rather we have tried to organize it in a semi-roundtable panel where different scholars will come to talk about different topics, and they have been chosen because they mostly agree but also disagree. So it will be scholarly disagreement and debate. The other is that it's hybrid, and this is an attempt to take the debate global, to not limit the discussions by who is immediately around us. And so there have been over 100 people who have signed up for the seminar series, who have registered for it, across the globe. The term just green transition is used quite frequently in scholarly debates and among activists. But what does just mean? Hence the name of the seminar series. So the idea of the seminar series is to foster a debate about and recognize that just can mean different things. And some of those different things can be complementary, but some of them can be contradictory. And we may disagree about just for whom. And so the idea of this seminar is really to foster a debate about that, to get into the nuances, find out where we disagree and agree, and to move beyond black and white positions so that maybe we can find a solution going forward, at least academics who we know often never agree with each other. If we can't find common ground, what hope is there for the rest of the world? So the seminar series has 5 seminars, and they're each framed around a question. And, a group of scholars have been invited to debate each question, led by a proactive moderator. And in a minute, I will turn over the mic to today's moderator. The seminar is hybrid, so it's being streamed on Zoom and recorded for future educational purposes. The format for the seminar is a bit less than a 1-hour panel debate, followed by approximately 30 minutes for questions and comments. We also want questions and comments from the people online. So I ask you, those who are online, to make sure to put your comments and questions in the chat box before the end of the panel debate so that they can be written down and given to Jakob for the Q&A session. We wanted to make it a tight program to not take too much time out of everybody's busy schedule, so it's just an hour and a half. Therefore, we only have time for 1 round of questions. So please make sure to raise your hand right away. There won't be a second round in this one. And with that, I will hand over to Jakob to introduce today's seminar topic, as well as the panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay, for inviting me here today to moderate this panel debate. I'm really excited to get into this topic. It's very important. I'm very pleased to see more sustained discussion of capitalism and the green transition, both at CBS and elsewhere. So before I get to the actual debate questions and before I introduce the panel, I have a very brief first task I'm going to do, which is to give a brief sketch of the intellectual landscape on which today's debate plays out. And I'm going to do so by drawing out some of the main ideas and tensions that were introduced in a recent special issue of Development and Change on the political economy of renewables capitalism. And this special issue was edited by Murat and features articles by both Nikita and Lindsay. So you'll be very familiar with this debate, of course. So for critical social science, including political economy and development studies, the question of capitalism and climate change is often portrayed as a dichotomy between system change on the one hand and climate change on the other hand. Either we must completely remake our social and economic systems, which means transcending capitalism through system change, or we must suffer the consequences of a dramatically degraded biosphere as capitalism continues to undermine the conditions of life on Earth, including its own conditions for reproduction. So this dichotomy rests on the assumption that capitalism cannot be greened. Many different arguments are made to support this assumption, but I'll just briefly mention three. So first, capitalism's growth imperative is incompatible with ecological limits. Capitalism is structurally driven by continuous accumulation and expansion, which is to say it must grow to survive. Thus, any reductions in emissions or ecological footprint are likely to be temporary and negated by the systemic re-expansion of materials and energy. The second argument is that market logics prioritize profitability over ecological outcomes. Profit maximization will always be core to any capitalist system, creating a structural misalignment between capitalist and ecological imperatives. Accordingly, green technologies will only be adopted and scaled up if profitable and if risk-adjusted returns are sufficient. The third argument is that even a green capitalism will reproduce inequality, extraction, and ecological harm. A green capitalism would require more materials, intensify resource extraction. It would also be likely to reproduce global inequalities, not only between the global north and the south, but also inequalities of class and race. So even if capitalism reduced emissions, it would fail to resolve the broader social ecological crisis. With those three arguments in mind, let's return to the dichotomy. Let's consider, again, system change versus climate change. On the side of system change, the most vocal academic camps are those advancing research on eco-socialism, degrowth, or post-growth. Here, some look to international solidarity, redistribution, strong states, or powerful institutions as the path forward, and others look to small-scale local organizing and social movements. In common, however, these perspectives all share this assumption that capitalism cannot be greened. If we turn to the other side of the debate, the position seems to be hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Hoping for the best means climate change won't necessarily be apocalyptic, and it is harder to change social and economic systems than fix the climate. Breakthrough technologies might yet be in our future, for example, large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Preparing for the worst means finding ways of managing and navigating climate and inevitably social and political breakdown it would lead to. But what happens if we consider renewables capitalism within this dichotomy of system change and climate change? And the broader question here is this: are constraints on green capitalism absolute, or are they contradictory but negotiable? Perhaps allowing for a partial, unstable green capitalism that offers a productive way forward when fossil fuels are substituted for renewables. That's the broader framing for the coming debate. And with that in mind, I'll just introduce our panelists and then we'll open with the first question. So on my left, we have Nikita from University of Oxford. We have Murat Arsel from the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And you already met Lindsay Whitfield, CBS. So let me just start with a very brief opening question. Is green capitalism an oxymoron? Who would like to begin?
Wow, everyone. Okay, thank you for the introduction to the panel, which was really interesting, and thank you for the invitation, Lindsay and Open Society Foundations. So when I was thinking about this question, is green capitalism an oxymoron? I was like, I can either talk about the normative, how it ought to be or how it is. And I'm going to go for the latter, and I'm going to speak based on field-based research in 3 of the biggest coal economies in the world, which is China, India, and Indonesia. And what I see there is an embracing of by coal and oil companies of the green agenda, right? So capitalism, the system which makes profit to plow it into further profit making with all the relations of land, labor, capital, enterprise, etc., is not averse to the green transition. In my field sites, big companies supported by the state are keen to go towards renewables manufacturing, so mass production of, say, solar cells, for export, for use in the local markets, and also for the generation of green energy. So I don't think capitalism cannot function within this green transition. But as the special issue also pointed out, what we are seeing right now is not a transition, it is an addition. So we see coal use, oil use, and even in the global north, the whole drill, baby drill kind of ideas, particularly in times of geostrategic uncertainty where oil is king, as we know. So there is not transition but addition, capital moving into green technologies because it is being very much supported and encouraged by the state, which has made international climate commitments, etc. What we are not seeing is the just bit of this transition. So in a very simple sort of way, if we think of it as taking everyone along, which is how many of the UN agencies define it, or in a more sort of legal distributive justice sense of the distribution of the goods and bads in society. The goods are clearly going to the companies that are getting into this green field of manufacturing renewables and generation. The bads are very much going to the kinds of communities that I work with, who are being displaced from their land, whose water is being tapped for the running of renewable infrastructures. So green capitalism can happen with many contradictions, but the justice bit is the question for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikita. I'll pose the same question now to Murat.
Thanks also from me to Lindsay, Jacob, and Open Society. Lovely to be here. It's a huge question, of course. Let me try to break it down a little bit and make it a bit more functionalist. That green capitalism, the green part, I think the first thing we have to consider is green for who and for what sort of need that we're thinking of this. Green for me or for an indigenous community in the Amazon might mean something very different than green for a business or for a nation state or for a European nation state versus a developing country nation state, right? So from a more strictly ecocentric view, perhaps, I do quite a bit of work in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Some of my sort of informants there, for them, of course, there would not be a green capitalism. By definition, the relationship that we have sort of put in place between nature and society in the last 200-300 years, starting in Western Europe and then sort of globalizing, there's absolutely no way that could be green. But I think there's more to this story. I think green, from the sort of vantage point of capital itself, if I can look at that, can be a lot more reductive. Green can mean essentially that the changes that take place in nature and in nature-society relationships need not be disruptive for the logic of capital, for capital to be green, right? So it's a lot more constrained understanding. To what extent does nature pose a threat for capital to reproduce itself? To the extent that it doesn't, I think from the vantage point of capitalism, that type of capitalism is or can be green. So I think the goalposts are quite different and much more modest if we try to define it within the sort of internal logic of capital itself. So that's one qualification. I think we'll dig in deeper, so I won't go much longer. But so that's one qualification I would make. The other one is, what do we mean by capital? I think if we think systemically, the expansionary nature of capital, as you outlined also, does make natural limits almost by definition, so like threatening to capital, right? As a systemic thing over the long term. But again, if we look at different sectors, I think some sectors are a lot more able, a lot more interested in, a lot more sort of receptive to searching profitability within a green capitalism than others. Oil business, almost by definition, again, is unlikely to be green. But obviously, it's a different question when it comes to solar power, right? So different dimensions of capital will have different meanings when you ask, what does it mean to be green? And I think some of that sort of like specification of what it means for capitalism to be green needs to be explored in relation to that particular domain vis-a-vis the type of natural demands it puts on itself. So oil business requires the atmosphere to do the job of absorbing its emissions. So we have to see what greenness would mean in that regard. But an entirely different fragment of capital will have a very different relationship to nature. And that, I think, makes it possible, no, that I think it's better to define it in negative. It makes it harder to give a definitive yes or no if we're thinking systemically. We have to look at specific aspects, specific sectors, specific interests within capital.
Thanks. So you can think about these as our sort of opening stump speeches, right? And so I think already you will see that we come from very different perspectives. Doesn't mean we necessarily disagree, but we're also going to emphasize different things. But it was very interesting to be in the workshop where we bashed each other's papers, and I really mean that in the literal sense. But it was very interesting for me because I was clearly the odd man in the room, and I would say most of the, if you read the special issue, most of the papers take an eco-socialism or a degrowth. Not all of them, but this was definitely the sort of dominant feeling in the room, and it was very interesting because I was on the defense, I was on the other side trying to see, okay, so how do I respond to that? It was very useful. But I think, so in my opening statement, I'm kind of talking to those people, so the people that you outlined, the eco-socialism, the degrowth, but also this dichotomy that there is no middle. It's you know, as you put it, you know, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, or it's we have to overthrow capitalism. Sometimes there seems to be little room in between. And I want to make an argument for that room in between, because I do consider myself a leftist and a progressive. But I don't think, and we'll get back to later, that it's helpful to you know, have a whole social movement to overthrow capitalism at this particular moment. But nor do I intellectually believe that it's necessary. So as my favorite economic historian, Sven Beckert, says, who just released a new book called Capitalism, if we look at capitalism historically from the rise of merchant capitalism through fossil fuel industrial capitalism to financial capitalism, it's been a very contingent and open-ended process, non-linear, and constantly meeting challenges and changing. But most of all, we are not just its subjects, we are its architects. So this idea that we have agency over and we create the systems. And so I just rebel against my colleagues who keep saying capitalism with a capital C. I don't believe in capitalism with a capital C. I believe it is what we make it. And in that sense, I don't think that the constraints are absolute. I think that they're negotiable. And I'm just going to make a quick pitch on that by engaging in a way with Brett Christopher's book, which has been highly influential in our circles. I don't know, and also in IOA, I don't know if you've read it, but The Price is Wrong, How Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And it relates to the point that you raised about profit motive, that profit motive is, irreconcilable with green. And I don't think this is true, so I'll just break down my argument quickly, and then we can pick up later. But it's just to give an idea where I'm coming from. So is there something absolute about capitalism that can't mix with renewables or can't be greened? No, but it's because of how we look at the features of it. So I think it's generally agreed in social science that the key characteristics that define capitalism are the profit motive, use money to make more money, private ownership of the means of production. However, this one could be questioned because state-owned enterprises where the state owns the mean of production also exist under capitalism and follow that logic. The commodification of inputs used in the production process, that land, labor, and goods are bought and sold in markets. That's basically it. And it doesn't seem radical to us today, but compared to other economic systems, as Sven and others have shown, it was quite radical when it emerged. Markets by themselves are not a defining feature of capitalism. So I think for me, the focus is on profit motive. And this is the central argument in Christopher's highly cited book, where he argues that it's not profitable to invest in renewable energy generation, so it's not done. Even though the cost of renewable energy has energy equipment and grid technology has gone down tremendously. This is the evidence that's kind of marshaled against that capitalism can't drive the green energy transition. And although I agree with a lot in the book, I think he misses two key points. One, the profit motive can and has been manipulated by states throughout the history of capitalism. So yes, firms won't invest in something unless it's profitable, but what is profitable is not necessarily given. And in fact, there are two key ways in which the profit motive has always been manipulated. Economic catch-up, technological economic catch-up by latecomer countries in specific industries, and innovation by advanced capitalist countries. And that actually includes a lot of the functioning of capitalism. In both cases, economic catch-up and innovation, it's not initially profitable for firms to move into industries. In catch-up, latecomer firms face incumbent firms that are already profitable, and while they have to learn and catch up, they're never initially profitable. So no countries would have ever moved past the first industrializers had not states learned to manipulate the profit motive. But it's also true for innovation. All the innovation we've seen in the post-World War II era, especially the hidden developmental state in the US, has manipulated the profit motive. Because innovation is not immediately profitable. It has to be commercialized, markets have to be made. I could go on and on, but not. But I just want to highlight these 2 points, that in both cases, governments use various mechanisms to make economic activity profitable until they are on their own, including making market demand. And then the second point is that, and this comes actually, I really like Chen's piece in the special issue on China, but reading that and then reading Christopher's again, what is considered by firms to be an acceptable rate of profit, a return on investment, and a time horizon on that is shaped by institutions. It's not given in capitalism. And the problem with Christopher's book is that it's Western-centric, and it takes the form of really existing capitalism today to be the only form of capitalism. And in this sense, the problem, and I saw this when I examined a Swedish PhD thesis on steel decarbonization in Sweden, is that the problem in Western countries is really maximizing shareholder value doctrine and the need for dividends and high payouts immediately. China doesn't have this. Many other countries in the world don't have this, so they don't face those constraints. So no, green capitalism is not an oxymoron in itself, but it may currently be in Western financialized capitalist economies.
Okay, thank you all. I'd like to follow up on one of the themes, Lindsay, that you just mentioned, which is this idea of how flexible and contingent could we expect, particularly renewables capitalism, to actually be. So it seems like this is one of the tensions running throughout not only the special issue, but maybe in this broader scholarship as such. Will capitalism inevitably determine the way renewables capitalism evolves or emerges, or will it be possible for renewables capitalism to also change the social relations of capitalism as such? So that might have been phrased a little bit difficultly. In other words, I mean, what I'm trying to say is how much could we expect renewables capitalism to differ from fossil capitalism? If we change the energy source, can we change the social relations? Where do you fall on this question? Murat, would you like to start? Yeah.
I think that's inevitable. I think the type of energy source, the materiality of how we access the energy, how we extract it, how we move it, how we use it, has very concrete implications for social relations at every level. So moving from fossil fuels to renewables will inevitably remake the world as we understand it. I mean, again, going back to one of my field sites in the Ecuadorian Amazon, there are about 1 million people, many of them indigenous, many of them highland colonizers who've moved into indigenous territories, that directly or indirectly make their living in relation, they not necessarily benefiting economically, but they make their living under the shadow of fossil fuel extraction. If we were to get to a place where the tap is turned off, I think the lives of those 1 million people will be dramatically altered. The formal jobs in oil sector are dominated by men. Those men will become unemployed. Women provide all sorts of productive and social productive labor around these. Those will be dramatically altered. The entire small cities that have emerged in relation to the expansion of oil business, those will probably become unlivable without oil and the oil money that flows through these places. I can't see how a city of 100,000 people that has developed in relation to oil extraction can survive. So patterns of urbanization, patterns of employment, patterns of gender relationships, patterns of agricultural production that happen around oil fields, all these will go. And I think this is just one small example. And I mean, of course, this is not a new thing. Timothy Mitchell had already argued a version of this with carbon democracy, saying that the type of extraction that happens around coal and oil shapes labor relationships, shapes state-society relationships. So any transition that, if it's systemic, if systemic enough for us to be able to call it renewables capitalism, will fundamentally alter societies, both in places where extraction is visible and concrete, but also in places where energy passes through, and also places where energy lands. I think the changes will be different, but I think we'll all be left in an entirely different world if we do indeed move from one mode of fueling capitalism to an entirely different one.
So just taking, further what Murat has said, that's a really interesting question. And I think, being the sort of nerd, I would like us to think about, concrete cases where, through which we can answer this question. So for Murat's field site, clearly lots of people will be thrown out of their job, and labor relations will clearly change when the source of fuel changes. Similar things happening in my field sites in Indonesia, in India. But the capital itself, the enterprise is very flexible. So, it's invested in coal, it's invested in green, it's invested in oil refining. So the flexibility is not with, labor, which remains in the coal town or the oil region. It is with enterprise. And that's where, the broader theme of the seminar comes in. That's where the questions of justice are coming in. And I followed discussions around the largest supposed transfer from the global north, G7 countries, to Indonesia, the world's biggest exporter of coal, and about more than 60% energy mix is coal. So planetary implications. People want them to reduce their use of coal. But when you start tracing the money, one, the funds don't actually materialize despite these big, questions of justice, etc. But when you start following the funds, they go to the enterprises to change their, source of fuel. And the idea is that it will fall to the state to look after the labor, to reskill labor, which probably connects to what's coming later in the discussion. But the flexibility, the funding is for the enterprises in the cases I followed, not for those who will inevitably be left behind.
So I understood the question a little bit different, but before I go into that, I just want to say, so I see what you're saying, Murat, just in the spirit of sparking some debate. But don't you think that it will be gradual? Or are you thinking it's going to happen all of a sudden? Because even if we really, really wanted it to happen all of a sudden, I doubt it will, just to be pragmatic. And that societies have to adapt all the time. So are you worried because it's going to happen suddenly? And that there'll be nothing to replace. It's too bad Jacobo's not here because he also works on these kinds of issues. That, he also says that communities want to have wind energy projects, even though a lot of groups argue against them, that they actually provide livelihoods. So I was just wondering if you thought that the transition would be too abrupt, or how that societies wouldn't be able to adapt.
At the systemic level, I think we have a bit more time, perhaps, but I think the temporality of the question, I think, makes it unique. And this is one of the key arguments of the introduction to the special issue, which was meant as a provocation, that there's something unique about climate change that is different from other major environmental problems. That climate change is almost like a ticking time bomb that forces capital's hand to make dramatic adjustments, because the types of ecological changes, ecological disruptions that are supposed to happen will not be very gradual, but there'll be tipping points, that there'll be a falling off point, and suddenly the North Atlantic might become so much colder that Europe goes into an ice age type of scenario, right? So for those, I think there's a temporal dimension, but we don't necessarily have to think of that in years, but perhaps decades. At the local level, I think for some of the fossil fuel producing countries, I can't see how. So, like, the Ecuadorian state, for example, had promised to leave its most important reserves under the ground. This is in the Yasuni National Park. There was a promise to leave, it's about 20% of Ecuador's oil reserves. The promise was to leave everything in the ground, sign an international binding agreement that Ecuador would never extract that oil. That's not going to happen over decades. An agreement will be signed. If we really mean what we say, that we're going to leave fossil fuels behind, certain spaces, certain locations will have to dry up very quickly. An agreement will be signed and fields will be decommissioned, and that has to happen within years. So for the Ecuadorian communities in question, this would have meant that almost overnight, at some point, an agreement would be signed and the taps would be turned off. There would be no time for adjustment. And these communities, as Nikita said, don't have the flexibility. Whether the state can step in and make it just or not is the question. But for some locations, the transition will happen very abruptly. It would need to be, because I don't think it's in the nature of the business itself that The field is either functioning profitably or it's not. If we can convince countries or corporations to shut certain facilities down, those affected directly will experience it very abruptly. They would have to.
Just to connect to that, in China, which of course is a certain kind of state, it has the power to turn off the tap. Private coal companies in, say, Inner Mongolia just get an order, you shut, and they shut. And then there's an elaborate welfare mechanism that's, steps in, which is not the case for many other countries.
Mm. Yeah, so I just wanted on. So I understood your question, Jakob, as going more towards what Benji's piece in the special issue talks about, where some on the ecological left say that, like, capitalism won't function similarly with renewables as it will with fossil fuels, and they talk about something called the energy return on energy invested, and these. And I just want to make a quick thing because I'd rather have a debate, but I just think, and it's the same thing with the degrowth data. A lot of these debates are more normative than evidence-based, and the evidence that they use are in models. And until you look at the model and the assumptions that are used in the model, you can't say whether that argument is right. But then that argument is sort of summarized and put out there, and it says, oh, the data says that it won't function the same, that renewables don't have the same energy, that factories won't be the same, so everything's going to change, and this is going to disrupt capitalism. But I think we need to be a little bit more scientific and look at the models and the assumptions, because a lot of that is based on what's happened in the past. And I don't think we can predict the future based solely on what's happened in the past. And I think, again, going back to this point that we are not just the subjects of capitalism, but the architects, I do field work now in EV battery firms and other firms that are using renewable energy, and the kinds of things that they are coming up with and the kinds of things they are doing are totally novel. And I think that there are whole ways of being yet that aren't. And I'm not a technological fixer necessarily, but I'm saying all of these evidence is based on what happened in the past, saying that we can't act differently. So I just want to say that I don't think that capitalism, that it's structurally embedded in fossil fuels, and that somehow renewables capitalism is not going to give us as much this return, the energy that it takes to get energy to use energy. I don't see that as a stopper, but there is a large literature debating this.
Okay, I'd like to turn to a slightly different set of questions now, because you've all hinted at the importance of the state, and we have to consider the role and the place of the state in relation to just green transitions under capitalism. And so I'd like to ask you about where you think the role of the state comes in here. To what extent we can also place our hopes in strong states to rein in fossil capitalism and steer us towards a more just and green future. So just to expand a little bit on the kinds of mechanisms we could envision here, do states retain sufficient autonomy and coordination capacity for this task? Can the state create truly just green transitions? Or is the state too tied to capitalist imperatives? And can the state discipline capital sufficiently to basically engineer, plan, and steer the green transition? So let's move a little bit here towards the state. There's someone who would like to come in first. Nikita, maybe?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's my favorite topic in the world, the nature of the state. Again, you can think about what the state ought to be doing, and there's this very excited, positive literature on the, disciplining role of the state capacity, the return of industrial policy in the area of renewables, for instance, and all that is wonderful. But then you look at, what has actually happened to the state over the past several decades. And again, I'll draw on the states I know and work with in the global south, in countries like India and Indonesia, apart from things like structural adjustment, where we thought, the state is too inefficient, bureaucratic, market should take over. That era is done. We're now in the era where the state works very closely, through joint ventures, public private partnerships, as a brand builder for countries to draw in investments, etc. So the state is really working with capital to make its territory attractive. That seems to be one of the big functions of the state in the places I work in. And in that context, states are competing with each other to attract renewables capital, right? And they, in my field sites, they are facilitating renewables capital. They are not disciplining it. So to give you an example, in countries like India and Indonesia, there has been a real struggle to have things like social impact assessments of big projects, any big project, big factories, etc., environmental impact assessments, etc. Now, when you have green capital coming in to set up, say, a large solar panel producing factory, those, hard-fought regulations are done away with because it's green. And that is done away by the state to encourage, green capital. So the state could be disciplining, but in the states I study, it is not. It is facilitating of capital and willing to let go of lots of regulations.
You mentioned autonomy, and I think, in a way, if I'm not misrepresenting, I don't need to maybe. I mean, there's not much. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if we go along with the argument that climate change poses a systemic risk for capital to reproduce itself, autonomy is not necessarily necessary for capital-state relationships for the transition to take place. The argument that we were trying to sketch out in the introduction is that it's in the interest of capital itself to engineer the transition, to the extent that the state is captive to capital interest in certain places that will only speed things up, because there are entrenched interests within state and society that sometimes militate against the transition. To the extent that one goes along with the argument that capital needs the transition to take place, because without the transition, the reproduction of capital is at risk, that means that capital can drive the state to put in, as Nikita suggested just now, capital can drive the state to open up the field and, flatten the ground and deal with messy problems on the ground to be able to actually speed up the transition. Only because, and I think this requires one to accept that there's a sufficiently large fraction of capital that needs to move to renewables. To the extent that is true, in places where that is true, you don't necessarily need state to be autonomous. In fact, the state can, in a very vulgar Marxist way, do the bidding of capital and just speed things up. And we do see some of that taking place. Not everywhere, this is very uneven, but that is one way for this to become real.
So I partially agree with you. There are some capitalists, I don't like to use capital as an animate object, but capitalists and industries who want to move. But I don't think we can say all industries want to. Fossil fuel industries don't want to use, right? Andreas Malm's Overshoot and other books have shown that they're making more profit than ever. So they don't want to move. So while that's true for some, it's not necessarily true for others. So I think it's in that category where they don't want to move. Then how does because there is this debate on linked to the industrial policy, how can you get firms to act in ways that they don't necessarily want to act? So I'll just add mine, and then you could go back. So I kind of fall on the side of Elizabeth Thurbin and their new book on developmental capitalism, where you need to create the green alternatives before you ban the brown ones. But really it's the political economy of it, because I don't think it's not politically feasible for countries to say to firms in their leading sectors, if those are fossil fuels, which is the US and Saudi Arabia and others, that we're now going to make you go bankrupt. It's never going to happen, right? Nor is to say we're going to put all our industrial policy focus on renewables and indirectly make you go bankrupt. It's not going to happen. So the only politically feasible thing that I see is that states use carrots and then sticks, but carrots first, to make brown capital invest in green capital. As Isabel said the other day, we're going to discuss Andreas Malm's new book, The Long Heat, like just pay the firms, right? But I'm not talking about just pay the firms, but the point is that you have to incentivize fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel-based industries to make the switch, right? Now, that would politically be feasible with the leading firms, but of course, populations don't really like that. It's not, on the other side, the populist side, it's not very feasible. So I don't really have an answer to that, except going back again to the profit motive with carrots. So if we're going to give so many carrots to fossil fuel companies to make them leave fossil fuels, which many voters don't really like, then we've got to do something for the voters. And there I really just go back. I think we have to address shareholder value maximization. And we have to make sure that the firms that we're giving money to switch into green are not giving that money to shareholders, which basically are the 1%. And that's tough, and I don't have a political feasible answer for that. But I think that, I mean, if anybody studies finance, I mean, money is leaking, or rather being drained out of companies. No wonder they have no money to, retain and reinvest, right? So I think that we have to deal with the palatable, which the left finds very unpalatable, which is to pay the companies we hate. Otherwise, we're not going to go anywhere.
Can I come in there? So much to engage with, but I'll stick to the last one. I think we'll just have to pay the rights holders. In some places, it will be nation states. It's, I think, only in the United States where the rights are private. The underground in Ecuador and many other places, 3 feet below the ground, the resources belong to the nation state. So in some places like Saudi Arabia, we'll have to pay the Saudi kingdom to not extract, perhaps more than what we've paid them to extract. In certain places, we'll have to pay corporations to stop extracting, to walk away. Again, especially if there's a temporal dimension to this, I think we can't wait for some oil companies, some fossil fuel companies might indeed invest in alternatives, but their record is extremely uninspiring in this. Even if some were to move in the right direction, that change is unlikely to be fast enough. And I think the sectoral dimensions of moving to solar power, there are other companies that are already cornering the market. So I can't see how Shell or Exxon will be able to become suddenly green energy providers. So we'll have to buy them out. And there's a precedent for this. I think the abolition of slavery in the UK, the slaves were not, the former slaves were not compensated, slave owners were, right? The British government paid off the slave owners to let go of their slaves. It's entirely unpalatable to think about it, but that's what it took. If we really mean what we say, that, I mean, if you look at the curve of carbon dioxide emission increase and where we're supposed to come down in terms of net zero in the next 20 years, this has to be dramatic. The pace cannot be left up to the incentive of capital to make a transition. We have to go cold turkey, and the easiest way to do this is to pay up. And we've done some numbers on this. There's a special issue in Global Environmental Politics from 2022 with myself and Lorenzo Pellegrini. There's a paper, we did a back of the envelope calculation. The numbers are large, but when you look at what happened during COVID, the amount of money that was spent by nation states in the West, like the British government paying people to have dinner, right? Buy one meal, we'll buy you another one. Entirely unthinkable under normal circumstances. Crazy things were done, and crazy amounts of money were suddenly created out of thin air to keep capital afloat. Something like that will have to happen, or we get to the apocalypse part that you outlined, right?
So, people seem to have cottoned on to this idea, right? If you see where the big climate finance is going, and obviously the world of climate finance is right now up in the air, but if you trace some of the climate finance, it's going to the companies to shut the coal plants, for instance. So, people are following this logic, but my argument would then be, don't call it just transition, right? There is nothing just about paying the shareholders and the companies rather than the labor who's also losing its jobs.
I just want to say, yes, I agree with that completely.
But then I would just say, Nikita, can you think about a way then that we can address climate change? So that's a green transition. Then what would be a politically feasible, one possible idea of something that would be more just? I don't disagree, I don't have anything in mind. I'm just saying, what else? What would be more just?
I can, think in the air, but, how states we are seeing lots of authoritarianism, right? So these coal sites, for instance, are big, grounds for, populist ideas to be brought in. Your enemy is, the minority who's even worse off than you, but is, intermarrying with your women and, whatever, taking away your jobs, etc. There are no jobs. So again, this is what is happening, right? So somehow states and politics have to reach the people that the money flows aren't. And again, this is what is going on. What I'd like to see is entirely different. And maybe the next question goes there.
Just before we get to the next question, I just had a quick reaction to Lindsay's policy, reading of the policy options and landscape and carrots rather than sticks. So I think there's a broader question that we're all speaking towards right now, which is the question of climate finance and the financialization of green transitions. And I think the question is there no hope to just try to block or circumscribe the power of financial actors today under the green transition? Do we have to read our policies through the landscape or through the light of sort of financial logics, or is there a way to maybe just try to change those logics? Is that a way forward? Because it seems like our imagination here is a little bit limited by assuming we have to work with the way finance looks at this today.
That's a misunderstanding. I don't think we need to work, or should we work? Mm-hmm. I think we need to change finance. So that's why I'm saying if we're hand-holding with the fossil fuels, they're not necessarily the same as the finance. So, and I was saying carrots before sticks, so I do think we need sticks. We do initially need to ban. But I think first we need to shift the capital because it's just politically unfeasible. So for example, get fossil fuel-based plants to switch to renewables. Then you bring the carrots through the feed-in tariffs, the long-term off-taker agreements that assures the profit motive. And then you address finance. Now, how exactly you do that, I don't know because I'm not a specialist in it, but I do believe that we can always make something happen. I don't believe that there's any limit of possibilities. There's only a limit of political will. So then we need to make sure that these firms actually become more innovative. That means they need to retain more. So we do need to address financialization. I leave that to other people who specialize in financialization, my good colleagues who aren't here today, but I'm sure there are lots of ways to do that because you can also divide and rule capital. And I think that's a technique that states should use because all capital doesn't have the same interest.
Okay, so that very nicely leads to the last round of questions here, which are more around the politics of just green transitions. What social forces or political movements might we turn to if we want to bring through system change, not climate change? And what kinds of changes are feasible in terms of social movements that we see today? So would anyone like to start this discussion by reflecting on what social forces, what political movements you see in your case studies or in your research that would be able to bring about just green transitions or societal transformations?
in. And I think we'll take everything we've got. I don't think it's one type of social force versus another one. It's not one type of action over another one. It will take people taking legal action. It will take people burning oil fields down. It will take people throwing soup at artwork. It will take all sorts. And I think I wouldn't prejudge what it takes. I think the larger ambition of social forces, and I don't think there's necessarily any need to coordinate as such either. I think what is needed is to, I mean, the argument that I was trying to make earlier on about the temporal nature of climate change and that it poses a risk to capital to reproduce itself. I think another necessary ingredient of the transition is to threaten capital from the side of social forces, to demand the transition and to demand that the transition is as just as it can be made. And I think in different places it will take different things. In the Netherlands, where I'm based, there are fantastic examples of legal mobilization, Dutch environmentalists taking the Dutch state to Dutch courts to demand that the Netherlands actually follows the promises it made to deal with climate change in a realistic way. And the Dutch state lost, right? So then they had to reduce speed limits on the roads, to shut down certain farms that intensive use cows. And so I think we'll have to struggle on many fronts at the same time to pose a risk to capital, and pose a risk to the state as well. I think state legitimacy is key here. I think to the extent that in places where states still have to earn their legitimacy, social forces demanding that something is done in relation to climate change and is done in a way that is just is an important consideration. And the example here is, of course, to the extent that social forces can threaten capital and the state, as they did in 1940s post-World War II Western Europe, a different economic model can be created. So that's sort of like the more optimistic, ambitious note. Let me sort of spoil that a little bit by saying that we shouldn't automatically assume that social forces are by definition progressive. The Dutch farmers that rose up against climate change are fundamentally, let me not call them racist, but they've used racist tropes, racist strategies to blame somehow, climate adjustment on migrants, for example, right? So not all social forces that rise up in relation to just transition will necessarily want justice for everyone or a transition for everyone. Some of them will actually want to stick with the old or transition in such a way that they're the winning side rather than someone else somewhere else getting a fair deal. So I think we need to be, social forces are fundamental, but we should not be idealistic about the shape they take or the direction in which they push always.
Just a quick note before Nikita comes in, and I think that's why I sometimes have problems with the degrowth and eco-socialism and all these articles, because when you read them, they really romanticize democracy and abstract it. How do we know people want more, that they want more democracy, or that people advocating for more democracy is also going to mean, degrowth? But they assume that there's this correlation between the two that I don't think is readily found. It could be either or, and we're seeing both, right? But we can't assume that. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, the system change or climate change question, I think, needs breaking down along scales. So, on the one hand, we can think about the planetary, where we are, counting the carbon atom, right? And that is, planetary scale, we are all in it, and, you know, there is an imperative and, you know, all of that. And then you go down to, you know, the communities, some of whom I work with, who haven't even carbonized, right? They don't even get coal energy, or, you know, they get 4 hours of electricity a day and would love more coal energy. So they are being asked to, you know, bear the brunt of decarbonization, which is fundamentally, you know, not on. And sometimes they are seen as the problem in this march towards green, whereas, you know, they can be progressive forces or not, but at that scale, we need to take on board, you know, struggles over livelihoods, so whether that's coming from coal or, you know, from whichever sector, we need to think about, you know, how nature and its goods and bads are being divided between people. So where is land going to be allocated? Where is water going to be allocated? What happens to air when, you know, highly polluting solar module factories come in, etc. So the idea that we must decarbonize is somehow, you know, the only logic that is at play, whereas I think we need to go to much more grounded ideas without romanticizing, you know, communities who can be very different.
But we are seeing some examples where, so it's true that the production of renewables can be polluting, and leftists like to point to this all the time, that there's a fundamental contradiction, you can't have both. But they also do that because states allow them to do that, also as your work shows. But Hungary is a very interesting case because we in Europe consider it authoritarian, but it's considered democratic from other lens. And in Hungary, there was a big protest against Samsung and SK On's early battery factories because they didn't adhere to the environmental standards on air pollution, and the state didn't enforce it. Now, the state has gone the complete other way, and like you need to fill out a 500-page document to get an environmental permit, which BYD and CATL are totally up in arms about, and other Chinese firms thought, you really expect us to do this? And they do. And the popular protest over it in Hungary has changed government policy. So I also think we need to look for small wins, and we need to look at where that happens, but also not to say that because there is this in one place, that renewables capitalism has to be like that. But of course, people have to fight for it. So I think with any kind of politics, you know, you have the capitalist organization of the economy, you have the political structures of rule, the political elite, and you have social movements for democracy. And as long as political theorists have existed, they have talked about how all three of these are in constant tension. And we need that tension. It's when one isn't doing something that then things can fall apart. And just a last point is I think we sometimes tend to generalize from what we know best. So in Europe, it's Europe, or India, or Ecuador. But I think we can look for examples where the politics is aligning and try to understand what are the conditions for that and how of course we can't replicate elsewhere. So of course we see that countries driven by economic catch-up and nationalism, although nationalism kind of ugly faces too, but they are moving into green technologies to leapfrog over foreign incumbents in brown technologies. China's the best example, but we also see this happening in Vietnam and Turkey and Morocco. And we see examples like of state-owned enterprises in Europe being used by certain political coalitions to change, so the case in Sweden. And it's successful in the sense that it gets locked in, so even when the political coalition changed again, they were already locked into this sort of investment in decarbonization. So we might not be looking for a grand politics, but like small wins that can add up. And I think that's where I disagree with the sort of degrowth, and we need system change, and we need big political movements, because I just don't see them on the horizon.
I think one thing we didn't talk about enough is the sort of differentiation in race and, location, etc., even within countries. So I think, you're absolutely right to be looking for good, positive examples, but they're in certain contexts. And even, you cited Morocco. There are communities within Morocco and, the sort of the margins where, you will not see what you might in the center. So again, we have to go look at what's going on to build a picture, and while keeping the good examples in mind.
Okay, so I could ask many more questions and keep this debate going, but I would also love to give the audience maybe a chance to ask some questions now. And I would suggest we start by getting some questions from the room and then maybe turning to the online participants afterwards. So why don't we start with the room? Yes, please.
But you have to wait for the mic because it's being recorded. Hello, and thank you very much for... Oh, just say your name. Oh, sorry. I'm Isabel Froes, and I'm senior advisor here at CBS and MSC as well, colleague of Lindsay and many others here. But so thank you very much for this great debate. Many questions, but I'll try to, it's just based on the aspects that you mentioned, and I will stick to one example, at least, a few points. I mean, when you talk about, one thing is the countries that are producing fossil fuels, right? I mean, these are countries that their economy are highly intertwined with that. So that's one aspect. But in the case of countries that are not producing but just consuming, we have a great example, which is Uruguay, right? Because they, and we can talk about the just aspect as well. I mean, and not romanticizing because there are many aspects here, but they did manage to change, right? To transition into renewable resources within, I think was like 10 years, or that's now 98% of their energy is all on renewables. It's with half of the cost of fossil fuels. They did use the feed-in tariffs that Lindsay had also mentioned. So that was their approach, meaning the government is paying for higher price of electricity, locked in for many years. However, this is 20% less than people were paying before. Right, so that's like, so there is like the 20 in terms of the price of electricity for the population, right? But for the companies, the government is still paying higher. So so here is a case, obviously it's 3.5 million people, small country, is not like a producer of fossil fuels, but it was just a consumer. So there is an interesting aspect here, and I mean, we can ask ourselves, is this transferable, right, or not? And this was definitely like a resolution of the government. This was like something that they decided, they went for it. So the question is, what would it take to transfer such model, or what we need to learn from this model at least, that which aspects can be learned from this model that can go beyond? And then just a little other thing, which is the aspects of changing in industries, right? Because if we would pay the fossil fuel companies, if they say to them, like, okay, no longer can do this, you have to find something else to do, right? So this is not impossible. This has, in terms of markets, we have companies have changed drastically their like production, like their like focus. And one example, obviously very different and not related to energy at all or anything like that, but related to another very different market. So Nintendo used to be a paper production, card production, like, and then they evolved into the digital and became what they are today, like very different, like 200-year-old company that transitioned into, new modes of play still, like, so I mean, it would be the same thing that it would, or if we can talk about farmers as well, if we talk about generative farming, like what it takes have the same thing. You need to pay in order for them to do the transition. So these companies, I mean, in the case of Nintendo, they weren't paid by the government. Obviously, this is a different thing. But in the case of state
control things. We have a few, examples in this area. So yeah, how transferable are they?
Okay, should we maybe take one or two more questions? Or we're only doing one round? All right, then let's here and then.
Hi, I'm Peter Lund Thompson, professor here at the CBS. My question is eco-socialism going to die out anytime soon as an academic approach? It seems to be very pessimistic in its outlook. So, any prospects for that?
One more question?
Hello, my name is Oscar. Interesting to hear your... well, I come from the University of Barcelona, Autonomous University, where there's a lot of degrowthers, and staying there, actually coming as a PhD student who was very degrowth curious, I came out more skeptic, but less skeptic than you. My question is today that to me it seems like domestic decarbonization is happening in many places. Yes, we don't see a global, we might not be seeing in global energy transition, but we might to a large degree be seeing additions, not just transitions, but we are also seeing transitions. If you look at national scale, Pakistan, China, there's so many examples of transition. Are they not capitalist? What's going on here? I don't get why we need to entangle the two things. So why are we seeing capitalist transitions towards renewables?
And one more? Are there, sorry?
Thank you.
Only one.
My name is Suna Hogbola. I'm a professor at Roskilde University, and I work on the Middle East. And I have my eyes on the war right now, which I think is quite related to the panel in some ways, because we see a disruption of energy flows that is quite unlike anything we've ever seen. And my question is about this dichotomy of electrostates and petrostates, and how you view that in relation to the topic today. Does it make sense to think of a club of petrostates, which I think the US in some ways is joining, including, of course, the GCC countries and Russia in particular, and then the challenge being really that joint interest and the way in which that's organized on the world stage, diplomatically, economically, and so on, because that core interest is to perpetuate fossil fuel production, right, and come up with smart arguments like we saw at the COP26 and so on. So any of the solutions that you propose there seem to me impossible unless you sort of break this geopolitical core or alliance of petrostates. That's the way I view it, but I'd like to hear your take on that, and whether you think in this dichotomy of electro and petrostates.
Can you handle one more, last one?
Hi everyone, this was a really great debate to listen to. It was really informative, so thanks everyone. I think my question would be to kind of rephrase the major question of this debate, because I think first of all we've made it quite obvious that there's not going to be a just green transition. We can throw the word just out. But my question would more be, so it can be green maybe, but you could say we can transfer the entire system of, let's say, vehicles from internal combustion to electric vehicles. And that would be green, but it wouldn't necessarily be ecological because it requires so many resources. So can we have an ecological transition under capitalism, given the growth and profit imperative under that social system?
Okay. Why don't we turn to the questions here? Yeah. But I think we'll do the online after, right?
But we only have time for one, for us to go around once.
I'm not sure. Can you take more questions? And
You can take as many as you need.
there's a lot to keep in mind.
And we will try to address all the points. So we take all the questions and then we'll answer to different ones.
Okay.
And I'm sure we'll choose different ones to answer.
Okay, so I'll read the one online question we received also, and then you'll have a broad menu of possible questions to answer very soon. So this is a question that goes into the relationship between modeling of energy and modeling emissions, and capitalism. So there's a lot of talk about models and the modeling of emissions, consumption demands, and so on. However, research, both quantitative and qualitative research, has shown the limitations or even flaws, which are largely conceptualized within the boundaries of capitalism. How would you adequately address these limitations and the inability to move beyond capital-based structures within the models if the models are already corrupted by capitalist conceptions? Okay. All right, so who would like to start by picking up on one or more of these questions?
I can jump in with the easiest one, or the last one from the room. I think, can this transition be ecological? No, at least not in the short term. I think the argument that we were trying to make is that the unique threat posed by climate change to capital might make it possible to diffuse that particular time bomb. But everything else, to the extent that the ecological problem doesn't threaten capital or doesn't threaten the legitimacy of the state, those will continue to fester as they have, right? So I think there's a uniqueness to climate change in this argument that presupposes that the best case scenario in the transition is that only climate change is solved. Everything else will probably get made even worse, right? The extraction that goes into, I mean, the amount of copper that we're going to need to build all these electric vehicles. In the case of Ecuador, we'll stop extracting oil from the Amazon, but we'll go to the highlands and start taking out copper. And that's going to create new injustices, different indigenous communities, similar types of extractive. All that will probably get worsened, and it might even be easier to justify them in quotations because, oh my God, we have to deal with climate change, so please park your concerns about copper because otherwise the world will get flooded. So I think everything else will probably make worse, not better, while we fix the problem of climate change. That seems the most likely scenario right now for me, which even if the climate dimension were just, and that itself is a problem, right? So that's one thing I want to say. I think we're going to run out of time very soon. The degrowth one and the eco-socialism one, in a way, let me see if I can connect them. My reading of the development of the degrowth literature is that degrowth has essentially become eco-socialism. The more recent versions of, I mean, I follow what happens at Autonoma, you know, more or less. I think some of the more vocal, let's not name names, but some of the more vocal proponents have essentially responded to the criticisms that earlier degrowth was a bit agnostic about capitalism and was very European-centric and all that. I think we have the quotations from more recent explanations of what degrowth should do, that if I didn't see the title, I would have assumed a 1980s eco-socialist text. So in some ways, that answers both questions. Does eco-socialism go away? No, it doesn't. Not that it should, but it will morph into things, and I think degrowth has assumed the mantle in many ways, at least within the Western European context. I think I share some of your skepticism of what degrowth is trying to accomplish, but the overall ambition of the latest version of degrowth wants system change, right? And whether that's possible in the short time frame or not is a separate discussion. But I think some of the demands are entirely sensible, that communities should have a right to say over their nature, they should have autonomy over how extraction is done, there should be meaningful sharing of economic rents and revenues, that states should decide things along lines of what's good for society rather than what's good for capital. These are entirely sensible things, whether you call it eco-socialism or justice or anything else. These hopefully will not go away anytime soon, and I don't expect them to. So that's 1, 2. Let me try to take one last one. China and capitalism, I forgot where it came from. China is capitalist, no? I mean, it's a different type of capitalism. We don't need to get into varieties of capitalism literature, but Chinese domestic markets are some of the most competitive markets anywhere when it comes to electric vehicles. The cutthroatness of Chinese capitalism is unparalleled right now. The state has a heavy hand, of course, but so does the American state have a heavy hand. It's not new, it's not a recent industrial policy thing. American state has always had, tipped the scales in the interest of certain segments of capital. So there's, in that sense, these are all different ways of conceptualizing and operationalizing capital, and China gives us one example, Uruguay gives us another one. I think in different places it will take different things. I don't think there's one path to transition. Different political and social configurations will take us to similar places, but in different ways. And within that, and that's my last thing, I guess, exactly which classes will align. This is not going to be a simple case of the poor versus the rich or the indigenous versus non-indigenous. I think we'll see some very novel configurations of class alignments in different places for different purposes that will take us to similar end results. And to where we will see the differences are probably to what extent these class coalitions can make the transition a bit more just. Entirely just, I think we've all agreed that it's unlikely, but in some places it'll be slightly more just than others.
Okay, those are all very interesting. The Uruguay and Pakistan question. I think we're in a moment, and connecting to Suna's as well, where we are, really looking for these positive cases. And I think at one level, when you think about climate change as carbon, this is a very positive story. Pakistan has had this huge spike in the import of solar panels, mainly from China. Uruguay is mainly going renewable on the hydropower front, but also on others. And at some level, that's a very positive story. I think as an academic, I'm interested in tracing, what these phenomena are telling us. And in the Pakistan case, to me, this is a story of state failure. So the state is unable to provide power. Therefore, industry gets together and basically privatizes power, right? So, and that state failure, how does that link to the larger questions of transition and just transition? The other story that's telling me, and again is linking to the Suna question about electrostate and petrostate, is the South-South cooperation that you see in both the Uruguay and Pakistan examples, because they're importing massively from China under favorable conditions. So, there's a lot of literature, and there should be, on the dominance of the petrostates, but there's so much happening in the world of energy, other than those very prominent examples that at least I'm interested in following. It's not always a positive story, but there's certainly a story in there. Can you have, again, the ecological transition under capitalism? I wrote a paper in World Development, which came out very recently, on how the whole carbon, climate change as carbon takes us away from ecology, right? So we begin with questions of climate justice, environment justice, with very grounded movements, people hugging trees because they didn't want them to be cut, or, movements around, black power and, access to non-polluted environments. All that is gone now. We're just focusing on carbon. So even if we have this transition, we've gone away from those questions. So it won't be ecological, like you're saying. I'll let you answer and then come back if there's time.
If I have time, I also want to.
Yeah.
So I think on the ecological, I think we all agree that that's not the pressing problem. So it's focuses on how to keep, or how not to overshoot as much as we're already going to overshoot. But I'm still not, I'm more of the optimist than the pessimist, because I think things are changing faster. And so if you follow energy, or if you follow battery chemistry, or if you follow these things, you tend to have a different view than if you read the news, because things are changing so fast. And right now, political leaders and CBS is concerned with the geopolitics of yesterday, not tomorrow. LFP is going to be yesterday's technology, and it won't matter who controlled lithium. Just like when Indonesia invested in nickel, and now NMC is not the dominant tech. We're going to see solid state, we're going to see sodium ion, and they all have different ecological footprints. So we're going to see both people losing twice because then they were being exploited, the nickel, and now it's not. Now they're complaining because it's not going to be exploited. But I think this is some of where we wanted to break just down, and not to black and white, but to the nuances of it. And then the last thing I want to say about, and we'll get to this later on, especially we're having Andreas Malm come and talk about the long heat, politics when it's too late. In many ways, it's too late. And when you read the environment science, you can get really, as I'm sure you know, Maria, really depressed. And if you read the news, you can get on what's happening. And so much is happening, and you are having not just additions, but the problem is it's too slow. And the problem is that energy use is growing. So when you see percentages or you see numbers, like you have these new installments, we have so much more new energy, but we're also pumping out more fossil fuels than ever before. And countries are also using more energy than ever before. And that's where my optimism fades a little bit into pessimism, because I really want to tell a positive story about the transition, but when you look at the numbers, they just don't lie. We have to do more faster, and that is, I think, what we were trying to get out. How do you do that? The only positive thing is, it's hard to read where things are going, because to Suna's question, but also Adam Hane's piece and our special issue, although he's very negative, if you read his piece, you can also read it a different way, that Saudi Arabia is doing two things at once. So maybe we need to hit a tipping point, but I guess the question is, are we going to hit that tipping point fast enough, where the petro states go over to the electro states? I never heard that before, actually, so it's interesting. But here, again, the world is not black and white. The role of China is so complex, because they're aligned with Saudi Arabia in negative ways, but also in positive ways. And then the US is negative in this sense, but positive in that, but also politics in the US may change again. So I think what I would just say is that we need to find political solutions, but it doesn't also help to see the world in these kind of black and white ways.
Yeah, I think my only remaining task is to give Lindsay the word for closing the seminar.
Oh, thank you. You could have closed. But thank you all for joining today, and thank you to the participants online for what I heard was a very engaging chat box. And we hope to see you all again on the next seminar on April 8th. And yeah, thank you for coming.